And good morning, everyone. We're live. Congratulations. You made it through the week. Another amazing week of food safety, food quality, awesome products that we all enjoy every single day. And if you're doing a good job out there, guess what? Nobody really notices, but Dustin and I, we notice. And we're here to say thank you. We appreciate all that you do. If you're new to the chat, pull up a chair. My name is Brian Armentrout, and this is the Food Safety Chat Live. And every Friday at 8 a.m. Mountain Time, 10 a.m. Eastern, we live stream on LinkedIn and YouTube, and we bring a show to you about a food safety topic. And what you'll notice here is that not a lecture, not a PowerPoint presentation. This is us talking with you, not at you. And that's really the really cool part about the show is, number one, I get to bring awesome experts like Dustin on the show. And the second part is you're part of it, right? And so your questions get weaved into the show and make it all that better. And we appreciate the investment of your time in helping to make that happen. So with that, Dustin's been on the show once before. And I think, Dustin, it was probably one of the most watched shows I've had because it's such a good perspective, and having you on here just brings something that I think that the quality assurance and food safety world, kind of the techies out there, are craving for, and that perspective is very rarely heard. So thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you, and I do take credit for that because I did pay a lot of people to join us last time, so it did cost a lot of money to take that honor. No, I appreciate it, and I think this topic is so important for your listeners, for the quality assurance people out there, and the branded sided people, and excited to have this conversation.
Yep, absolutely. So everybody's filing in here. So Duncan's over in the UK. Good to see him. Vaughn is here. Elena, Jordan. So we have a lot of our very loyal participants who are joining us here on the chat. So Dustin and I worked together in the past at White Wave Foods, and that's how we got to know each other. And we're both in the Colorado, the Denver metro area, where it's going to be, I looked at the forecast here, 80 degrees today. So we've had some rain, which was awesome. My yard looks great. So in Colorado, this is the time of year, the end of May, June, your lawn looks the best it's going to look, and then everything just goes to crap through the rest of the summer. You try and
I always
maintain
get
that.
this false hope right now. I'm like, I'm doing well, and then
It's like, yeah, there's no dead spots, and yeah, no, doesn't happen that way. So preparing for our chat here today, and so with Dustin, and this is abbreviated. I don't know how you do all of this stuff. So you are the founder of McRae Consulting. You're an adjunct professor at the University of Colorado in Boulder, and you're the CCO, the Chief Commercial Officer for two companies, KJoy and Fable Fish. How do you sleep?
Not well. Actually, I am very fortunate to have the opportunity to work with so many great companies. I have quite a few kind of smaller CPG clients that we work with, and for all of us on this, we know that CPG is a challenging industry, and
Yes.
so as I like to describe it, I try and help our clients ensure we watch out for the landmines out there and stay away from them. And we'll actually get into this probably through this talk. My job is to help them understand the options that they have, the good and the bad of the decisions they can make, and then ultimately it's their company. As a previous founder, I started my own food company, as some might know. And one thing, I take a lot of empathy to the challenges, to the loneliness, to the struggles, to the difficulty. And so I think it's our job, regardless of the role you have as support people, to ensure that we're giving the best advice possible, but respect that the brand owners, it's their decision and their ownership of the company. And so I try and do a really nice job. Once in a while, I'll probably fall on the sword on something that I feel very strongly about, but generally speaking, I think it's important to know that these people have put their life into these companies, whether it's their company or they're CEO of a company. It's such an amazing opportunity, but it carries a lot of stress, a lot of loneliness, and a lot of sleepless nights, as you mentioned.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So as we get started here, everyone, join us for a drink of your favorite.
You probably can't see. Oh, there we go. I can see two.
There they are. Nice. Cheers, everyone.
Cheers.
Very nice cup of coffee here this morning. Right, perfect temperature.
Yeah, nice.
So with that, with your academic background, Dustin, I did a little research, and I wanted to find a topic here to kind of educate everybody and give a little extra to the chat here this morning. And I came across this. There was a recent university study, and I was very surprised by this. It said that women should not have kids after 40. Yeah, I read a little bit more into it, and I was very surprised. I have to say that I agree with the study, because 40, that's way too many kids.
I was waiting. I knew there was something coming here. I knew you could be that controversial. I was waiting for that. I was waiting for that. That's a good one. That's a good one. Most of my dad jokes are inappropriate, so I'll save those for another time.
So as we were preparing, so number one, right, having people with the CEO perspective on is very rare. And what caught my attention, I'll put a link to the end of our chat here for everybody. There's an article from a few years ago from Bill Marler, of course, very well-known food safety attorney, on the food safety and the CEO and keys to bottom line success. And that was kind of really the jumping off point for our chat. And I'll include these notes in the information as well on the database. Dustin came back when we were preparing with two pages of information relative to what QA should be thinking for this. And anybody who saw the announcement for the LinkedIn, for the invite for the chat here, I started off with saying, one of the main complaints, Dustin, in the food safety world is, oh, I'm trying to do all these wonderful things for the company, but I'm not getting anywhere. The CEO just won't listen to me. It's not my fault. Really?
Yeah, I was thinking more about this morning again, and the term that came to mind was using fear as a tactic to get people to do what you want. And
Yeah.
I'm not saying that QA is manipulating or using fear, but when you frame things in the spirit of this might happen, we might get a recall, or God, consumers are going to get upset. I think in most cases, we take those things with a grain of salt. Our idea
Yeah.
is that won't happen to us, or we'll deal with
Mhm.
it when it comes. I think you need to frame the problems, and I say this constantly, and I said this last time, and I say this on every chat call I'm on, which is quantitatively propose your solutions and your issues to the CEO. Ultimately, we want to know how it impacts sales now. As
Yeah.
a company, as a for-profit company, and even as a nonprofit company in most cases, your job as a company is to do one thing, and to sell more product to more people. That is our job. And if you
Yes.
keep that in mind, whatever role you're in, if you keep that in mind, it's really, really important. When we both worked with a great lawyer back in the day, White Wave, Roger Theodoridis, and we were talking about this in that he did such a great job of presenting the options and then the risk associated with those options. If we do this, here's what may or may not happen. If we do this,
Mhm.
here's what may or may not happen. Here's the risk level of that. Now, what's a decision we should make? And just like I said in the intro, once in a while he'd fall on the sword and say, I would strongly recommend you not do this. And here's why. And when he said, here's why, he didn't say, well, we might get sued. He'd say, we might get sued, and here's the implications of that lawsuit. And so,
Right.
as a QA person, I think it's framed the same way, which is here are the options, here's the implications, here's the benefit to the company. And again, framed in the benefit of the company, not the risk as much. Constantly it's risk, this might happen, this might happen. Well, here's the benefit to the company. Here's how we can increase sales to the company. And I think if we start framing things more in the opportunity to grow the company and the impact to
Mhm.
helping the company drive more sales, I think that can be super helpful. And we'll talk probably more about financial and quantitative ways to do that, but that's a great way to start thinking in the positive, thinking and framing for the opportunity to grow, not so much as a risk manager, not
Mhm.
so much as, one of the things I put in my notes is the department of no. It's the department of, hey, here's the options, here's the considerations, and here's how we need to think about it.
Yeah. Bottom line is, guys, and this is it's a hard pill to swallow, is everything has risk. Everything has risk. You get in your car and you go to the grocery store this morning, you're taking a risk. Right now,
Yep.
you take actions to minimize that risk. You drive the speed limit, you watch what you're doing, you wear your seatbelt, your car's in good shape, and your brakes are working, all those good things to minimize that. But there's still always a chance that some knucklehead is going to run that stop sign and T-bone you. Right? It's there. And a good way to think of this, so Scott Adams on his podcast, when he talks about issues like this in the political sphere, I think it's a good message for this as well too, Dustin, is that he'll talk about things in terms of percentages. he'll say, well, there's probably, this may happen, but it's probably a 15 to 20% chance that will happen. What's that based on? Well, some of it's based on experience and metrics, if you have them. You may not. There's some situations where you don't. And I think a lot of times, and this is kind of the paradox of this, is as a technical person, I should be thinking in those terms. But sometimes I'll get very anxious about something, especially if it comes to food safety, and I may come running to you as a CEO with my hair on fire, and you're like, "Oh, whoa, what?" And then you react to that, and then nothing happens. You remember that, right? The next time I come running to you with my hair on fire, you're like, "Oh yeah, I remember the last time you did this." Right? I'm not going to act as quickly this time.
I think that's true of any department, and I've been guilty of that myself. I mean, I think we all have, which is that anxiety of the moment creates this stress and this fear, and you think everything is going to fall apart. I think if we all look at and I'm going to get more conceptual here beyond QA. I think we all look at our lives, right? The things that we thought were going to explode in our face in that moment. Typically, time solves a lot of problems, right? So
Yeah.
giving time to think and process. The one thing that I think if all individuals in the organization, and by the way, I think a lot of this topic that we're going to talk about goes throughout the organization, whether it's QA or finance or sales or marketing. But if you frame things in the benefit, again, of sales, number one, and if you frame
Mhm.
things from a P&L mindset, number two, I think that's really, really important. So it's not that this is going to happen or that's going to happen, or I think we need to invest in this quality assurance program because if we don't, such a risk of a recall. I think it's, again, framing things in terms of the P&L. And for those of you who aren't as P&L familiar, I think it's really simple, right? I'm going to break the P&L down to its simplest form. It's sales and cost, right? That's
Yeah.
the entire driver of a company. Cash flow comes out of that, right? If you sell more than it costs you, you're going to make money. And so if a company needs to invest $100,000 into a program or an equipment, how is that going to drive sales? And
Right.
again, I think in a lot of cases, we're thinking in QA or in other departments, well, here's what's going to prevent from a loss. I think if you really start thinking about that, it's a fear manipulation technique, even if you don't mean it to be. It's talking about something in the future that may or may not happen. The risk may or may not happen. And so ultimately, you want to frame things and here's how it's going to benefit the organization in a positive metric. Here's how it's going to drive sales, and go from there. So I think it's
Right.
really about making sure that we're being positive, um, quantitative. Sorry, I froze for a second, so I lost my train of thought. And making sure that we're going to ultimately drive that growth for the company. So, and I'm happy to go into more detail there because I know that's all conceptual, and I'm happy to kind of
Mhm.
give a finance lecture, as you mentioned. But ultimately, we really want to think about driving growth for the company, not the risk that may detract the company.
Exactly. And here's a good example from the QA world is consumer complaints. The CEO needs to have a direct line to consumer complaints to understand what the consumers think of the product. Back to your point, Dustin, on velocity and selling products. You want to make sure the consumers are happy. Companies are really good internally at guessing what they may think is the next new thing, the next cool thing that consumers want. Okay, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. What are those drivers associated with that product? So, an example from my past, I worked with French cheese companies. Of course, we made brie. And we spent a lot of work figuring out with consumers what drove likability for brie. So you would buy a piece of brie and you would open up the package and it's nice and this pretty white flora penicillin on the outside of the cheese. And then you cut it and it's got that nice texture and the flavor. You screw those things up, oh man, you're going to hear it. And I would. And one of the key drivers on that, Dustin, was shelf life. The closer you got to the end of the shelf life, the crappier the cheese got, right? And then your complaints would go up. And there was one particular issue where the sales team was getting a lot of product on the shelves that wasn't moving, velocity, and they were having a lot of spoils. So they were then having to eat that cost, P&L. And they came to me and said, "Hey, Brian, if we extend the shelf life on this product by 5 days, we're going to save a lot of money on these spoils." I'm like, "Well, yeah, I hear what you're saying, but let me show you some data on
Yeah.
what the consumers are going to do to us if we do that." So you think you're saving money, but you're not. And the decision was easy. The company understood really clearly, no, we're not going to increase shelf life. We got to figure another way.
Well, actually, I think this is a great lead in into the data and insights you should put on. Every company, even small companies, typically have some type of dashboard, some type of monthly meeting, some type of
Mhm.
regular analysis. We'll talk a little bit bigger. Typically, companies have, your MBRs, your monthly business reviews, or something. I think it's really important to figure out which QA metrics belong on that sheet and how to then quantify them, right? And I think in your case, and honestly, I hadn't thought about this before, but a great partnership from QA should be with sales and marketing, right?
Yes.
Because what they can do is sit down with marketing. Hey, marketing, what are you trying to drive? What are the messages you're trying to communicate? Okay. And how does that play back through QA? Hey, sales,
Mhm.
how do we think about velocity? But one thing I have every company, regardless of size, do is track consumer complaints and compliments, by the way. And I
Yes.
watch those things, and over time, you start seeing trends. And so, to your
Mhm.
point, you start seeing these complaints about texture or quality, and then you see this continuing to increase. Well, now you have a texture quality issue, but what's the real driver? And in your case, it was shelf life, right? Or when it was happening
Right.
on the shelf. And so, dating, coding, and so it's really important to get all that information. If you go to the CEO and say, we're getting consumer complaints around quality, well, what's going to happen? The CEO is going to say, well, let's go figure it out. Versus if you come and
Mhm.
say, hey, these are the drivers. It's a shelf life issue. It's a timing issue. We need to think about how we're managing our on shelf presence. We should think about, um, in working with sales and marketing, we should think about discount and trade programs as we get closer to the end of the shelf life, because that's when our consumers' complaints spike up. That's
Yeah.
a very proactive way to drive increased sales, decrease risk, decrease quality concerns. That's a home run way to solve that problem. So that's in partnership with marketing, in partnership with sales. You come back to the executive team and you present a program and solution. That's the classic win-win. So to me,
Yeah.
that's really how to handle a situation like that.
Exactly. And the answer maybe in that scenario too is like, wow, maybe we need to have an R&D project to figure out how to make the product last longer on shelf. You're bringing solutions to the organization. You're just not saying we have too many complaints.
Right.
Okay, what do we do about that? I don't
Right.
know.
Well,
That's
and
that's
that's
worthless.
why partnership is so important. And I think, in companies of the size where you have these siloed roles, I do think QA gets a bad rap, and sometimes ops,
Mhm.
right? You see the classic battle of ops and sales versus sales, right? What sales wants, ops going to fight back, and vice versa. And then
Yeah.
marketing somewhere in the middle. Again, I always, and this is just my framing, I've always said in every company I've ever worked at, especially at a higher level, we have one job to do, and that's to sell more product. And
Yes.
so everything should be in the vein of doing that. And in this
Mhm.
case, I think it's such a great example that if, I know it's easier said than done, but I think, man, you would make a big improvement if QA, and again, I'm using stereotypes, but if QA came to the sales leadership and said, hey, I want to partner with you to drive more sales. I think the sales leadership would be like, whoa, I haven't heard that before from QA, right?
Yeah.
Let's sit down. Here are the issues I'm seeing in QA. Let's figure out what's driving that. Again, using your example and just being repetitive here, it seems to be happening close to the end of shelf life. The
Mhm.
natural response, and I would give the same responses, let's extend shelf life. The smart response is, well, that probably makes the problem worse. And
Mhm.
so let's talk about what the solutions might be. And in my case, if you can extend the shelf life, which that's a longer R&D project, let's drive up increased trade closer to the end of shelf life so we don't get to that time where we increase complaints. And one thing I always preach also, for every complaint you get, there's probably, just depending on the size of your company, 10, 20, 100 other complaints you're not getting on that same issue.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So you can frame
100%.
that out and solve that problem. So yeah, I think it's
Yeah.
great.
Yeah, here's a really good example from my past of sales and quality working together. So back to my cheese experience. I worked with a company that made a lot of mozzarella cheese for pizzerias, and their big chunk of their business was food service, sell all over the country. The market for cheese in the Northeast is completely different than the market out west. How so? Back east, they don't want their cheese burnt. They don't want blisters on top of the cheese. Why do New Yorkers fold their pizza slices? It's to drain the oil off. They use whole milk mozzarella in that market, higher fat level. Western pizza, part skim. They want to see blisters. That means it was cooked. And if you don't get those two metrics correct, you're going to get complaints. And we were seeing complaints in the Northeast with pizzerias. I actually hired a person in QA, and his job was to go with the sales team on quality calls to pizzerias to figure out what was going on. And we found some very enlightening things. So you have different types of ovens, right? Deck ovens and conveyor ovens and these type of things. And what we found was in a lot of conveyor places, time and temperature and the amount of time that that cheese goes to the oven, super critical to getting it baked correctly. Well, if you're making pizzas in a restaurant on a Friday night and there's a line of people out the door, the temptation to turn that temperature up a little bit and speed that belt up a little bit to get those pizzas out, really high. And now you're burning your pizzas. So my QA guy would work with the restaurants to say, here's why this is happening and here's why this is so important. And we saw complaints drop like stones.
Yeah, here's one that actually just dawned on me recently. Never had thought about this. So if you're in the frozen marketplace and you put your product on shelf in the frozen doors, what happens at the grocery store constantly? Open, close, open, close. And I didn't realize this, the temperature fluctuations that creates is significant. So if it's supposed to be at 20 degrees, and I'm kind of making that up, right? It's you're seeing temperatures double, triple that level because of the constant influx of opening and closing those doors.
Yeah.
What happens to the product? Thaw, dethaw, thaw, froze, thaw, freeze, impacts quality, impacts consumer perception. And so if you're sitting in QA or complaints, customer service in your organization, and people are talking about your product being dry, people are talking about, again, if you don't get out into the marketplace and understand what's happening, and then say, okay, now this is an R&D project potentially, not really a quality assurance issue, or this is a sales conversation to have with the retailers about potentially what improvements could be made, it changes the whole landscape. Meanwhile, you spend hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to reformulate, and it really has nothing to do with you. It has to do with the fact that consumers are opening and closing these freezer doors, right? And
Yeah.
so I think it's really important to get out into the marketplace also to see how consumers are using your product. And I think there's nothing better than that. And so I'm a big fan. I'm not a big fan of like formal research. So like focus groups, they have their purpose, but ethnographies, all these things where it's like forced studies, people know they're being studied, they act differently. I think trying to get into real world situations as much as possible, going to a pizza shop and just sitting behind the counter as a consumer and watching, is much better than watching them up close because they might change their behavior, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so I'm a real big fan of kind of real world research and just watching and observing. It's amazing. There's the founder of IDEO, for those of you familiar with IDEO, an incredible innovation company. He talked about empathetic learning. He's like, you don't have to be smart, you just have to watch. And he says a lot of tech developers don't do this, which is watch how the person uses your product. And if you just watch them, you'll notice when they get stuck, when they get frustrated, when they don't like the experience. That's the point you need to fix. And I think that's really critical also.
Absolutely. This is absolute gold. And we have to mention this because you had this in your notes, and this is, everybody pay attention to this. Is Dustin said that there's your department in quality. What we need to be focusing on is three things: brand protection, customer retention, and scalable growth. And guess what? Food safety and food quality fit under that. They're not separate, right? If you're doing a good job at food safety and food quality, and you're thinking it in terms of brand protection, customer retention, and scalable growth, you're going to win and you're going to be successful in that role. Those three things it's a great way to look at it.
Thank you. Yeah, I think just got to be careful about, again, and I hit this 1,000 more times as much as we have time, frame it in the positive of growth. And by the way, for those of you who know me out there in this virtual world, you'll know this is something I've worked on too, because you do get fearful, you do get scared of what might or might not happen. And so I've really worked very hard to start thinking about how to frame things in the potential for growth and the potential for benefit versus the risk profile. But it is important. And again, going back to Roger, who we both know, I think it's really important to say, hey, here's what's happening. Here is the risk. Here's the benefit. Here's the information to make a decision. And you said this already, and I think it's critical. If you come and you do the boy who cries wolf just one or two times, the person you're going to is going to be like, oh, Brian was always stressed out about this. This is always his hot button topic. Don't worry about it. It's not a big deal. Well, one time it might actually be a big deal, but we just neglect it because it's just Brian being Brian. And I
Yep.
think being cognizant of how you're perceived within the organization and how you present things. And if you feel like this is an area for improvement, I'm a huge fan. There's so many, like I love the, what I call the self-help business books, um, business coaches, or find someone in your organization or outside your organization that you think can frame these things. And in today's world, we have this little thing. I know people are starting to hear about AI, and I do this all the time. If I'm not sure how to present an idea, I will just bluntly type it into ChatGPT and say, how do I present this in a way that's, humble, proactive, optimistic, whatever I want it to do. And it's so helpful in doing that and reframing your thinking. And so if you are struggling to figure out how to frame something positive, just type it into AI if that's something you like to do and ask it to help you reframe your thinking. And it's such a powerful way to start learning the verbiage and the way to communicate in that more positive ROI focused manner.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm using Grok more and more.
Grok's a great one. I kind of joke. I'm like, you type into any AI, like, you son of a bee, I can't believe you did this. And then you type in, like, make this a proactive conversation. Dearest colleague, I'd like to inform you that. So, anytime there used to be like sleep on it rule, like sleep overnight before you react, or, get some time between you and the issue. That's what I use AI for nowadays.
Yeah.
Create that separation of it. Yeah.
Yeah, and inherent, I want to pull something out of what you've been talking about as well that is implicit, but we haven't actually called it out, is that when QA is presenting data to the senior leadership, to the CEO of the company, your data needs to be framed up terms of forecasting information, not reporting on what happened last quarter. It's like, oh yeah, complaints were up last quarter. Okay, whatever. It's everybody already knows that. It's much more useful to say, all right, for these particular products, here's the trends that we're seeing. We're seeing an uptick in complaints for texture. I'm concerned about this. We're tracking this. I've got some people out in the field who are doing additional work, and we'll have more to follow up on that. We're going to make sure that this trend doesn't continue. Oh, okay, good, right?
Yeah.
You're looking at things going forward, not backward.
Well, I think this is a huge issue in companies as a whole. And again, so much of what we're talking about goes beyond QA, which is the classic, and 99.9% of the people are going to have heard this, right? Don't present a problem without a solution, right? And I'm not saying that's always possible. There are definitely times where you generally don't have a solution and you do need to present the problem. But those are the exceptions, not the rule. And so again, history helps inform the future, right? If you ever watch those finance commercials, they'll say past results do not guarantee future performance. It's the same kind of issue in real life. And so what you think about is, yes, those are trends. They're informing something. Using the cheese example now that we've hit a few times, I think partnering with your cross-functionals to say, come back to that meeting and say, here are the trends. Here's what we've seen. Here's what we're doing about it. Here's how we'd like to move forward. Any thoughts? Nope, great. We'll come back to you with our game plan. That's a phenomenal way to deal with an issue versus, oh crap, we're getting consumer complaints. Everything is not good. We need to switch this. We need to fire that. That's not helpful, right? That's not very helpful.
No. And to your point, you need to be proactive on these things. So marketing, so one of the things when you're out doing consulting and working with your own business like I do, as opposed to being inside of a company all the time, is you get a very strong respect for these other groups. The job that marketing has, extremely difficult, right? They're being constantly hammered. Back to your point, we need to grow, we need revenue, we need scalability, we need new products. Here's what the competitors are doing. What are we doing? And the marketing people are just like, right? They're trying to figure this stuff out, and R&D is figuring out how to make it and all these things. The quality group needs to be plugged in directly with marketing. Why? Because they need to understand for those new product developments, those new initiatives, what are the key drivers that the consumers, back to your points earlier, Dustin, what do we think at that point in time? We may not know, but what do we think are the key drivers for this product that the consumers are going to use for their purchase decision? I need to build that into my quality metrics so I can monitor that. If I'm being reactive, that's not going to help, right? Oh, hey, guess what, guys? That product we launched, everybody hates this aspect. Well, great. Why didn't we know that before?
Yeah. I mean, I think very few things in life are black and white. And
Yep.
I'm just debating as you were talking about that, about giving this example, but I'll do it anyway.
Yeah.
Back when I was one of my jobs, I won't name it for protecting the guilty, but back in one of my jobs, I was CMO and I was running R&D and innovation, and I hired the QA team for our organization. And
Mhm.
I was very frustrated because everything came back as you can't do this. This is not going to happen. This is the problem. I always felt like there's always a solution. Now, I always joke that solution might mean $10 million. I mean, that might be the solution is we just need to get a private jet and fly to, Europe and pick up something. I don't know, but there's always there's most
Yeah.
cases a solution. And so what I ended up replacing that team and found great QA and operations and R&D individuals who frame things in that message, which is, hey, okay, you want to do XYZ. I see the importance. I see the timeline. Here are the implications of that. Here's what we need to do to make that happen. Here's how I'd like to frame that, test that, learn about that, whatever it is. This is the cost. This is the benefit. Okay, that's a different conversation. Now I respect how you're thinking about the problem. And by the way, you might actually get what you want, which is me being like, you're right, that's too complicated, never mind.
Yeah.
But if you frame it as like, can't be done, it's impossible, it's going to cost too much, consumers are going to get hurt, we're gonna be like, really? Is that true? Versus, here's how we could get it done, but it's going to cost this much money and it's going to be this much work and this much time. Okay, well, now that's a real conversation to be had. It's a
Yeah.
very
Exactly.
different way of framing the issue.
Yeah, on our last chat, you had brought up a visualization that stuck with me is that you're the CEO and you're walking down the hall and you see the head of QA walking toward you. Are you looking forward to speaking with that person? Or are you looking for maybe another way to walk, right?
Yeah, it's just again, we all have stereotypes, and no stereotype is exactly true in every situation. But it's the same with lawyers. Like, what are lawyers going to do? And accountants, and finance, and sales, and marketing. Every department has a stereotype. CEOs, executives,
Yeah.
we all have the stereotypes. Ultimately, again, and rehash this. If you frame things in terms of driving growth for the company and how to drive more sales, you will be successful regardless of what role you sit in the company, because that is the job of the company. The CEO, in most cases, you're private equity owned. I mean, you might be publicly owned, you might be private and you have investors. It doesn't matter. Either way, everyone's looking at one thing. Are you driving growth for the company? That's it.
Yes.
And that's the stress on the CEO. How am I driving growth? Problems are just that. I mean, and I've been CEO of multiple companies. Most are smaller, and, call it 0 to like 30 million. I've had a couple bigger roles, but either case, feel like our job is to drive growth, but so many times we're firefighting or dealing with problems. And
Yeah.
so the staff that I loved were the staff that came to me with problems and solutions and who demonstrated that they would execute against that, regardless of the role. So that, Brian, if you came up to me, you're like, look, here's the issue, here's what I want to do about it, here's how we're going to solve it, and you've proven that track record, you're my gold mine. Great, got it. It's a problem I don't have to worry about it anymore. And that's really how you want to present yourself to executive leadership or to your boss or to your
Right.
peer. So
Yep. Because a lot of times in quality, Dustin, one of the complaints that I hear is, and in this frame, I'm very anxious to see how you layer this in, is quality will come to leadership and say, hey, we need to fix this problem, whatever. And the answer they get back is, it's not in the budget, right? And then QA is like, okay. But really, that's a failure on their part, isn't it? When that defensive statement comes up.
well, I was going to say, how much does it cost? And then, yeah, that's not in the budget. Again, let's get into math a little bit, right?
Yeah.
I always say that everything can be quantitatively decided. I'm a big fan of every decision in the company should be 80% quantitative and 20% qualitative. So even sales opportunities. I deal with a lot of shiny object syndrome in my world now, which is, oh my God, XYZ retailer wants us. That's phenomenal. But they want this and they want that, and we have to launch this product. I'm like, that's all great. Let's look at this from a quantitative perspective and understand the implication of it to our cash flow, to our business. And so I'm kind of being the negative one, I guess, in that scenario. But here's what I'm doing is I'm saying, let's look at it from a quantitative perspective, right? Because then it's not my opinion. It's not your opinion. It's a black and white. This is, I guess, where it is black and white. This is the ROI. Then the 20% comes in. Are there strategic benefits to the organization and how and why we should make this decision? So let's use a QA example. A piece of equipment or a system or a project, it's going to cost $100,000. Making this number up. What I would do is sit down, because you've now developed the relationships with finance, with sales, with marketing. I would layer that in, understand the benefit to the organization. So it's going to cost us $100,000, but the payback is 7 months because we're reducing complaints by 30%. That 30% translates into 3 more units per store per week of sales, which equates to $500,000. 5 times ROI, boom, the CEO or executive leadership is going to be like, oh, wow, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. Right.
That's the way, again, simple example, but that's how you frame these types of opportunities.
Right. And generally in companies, just so everybody's on the same page here, most food companies are dealing with about a 3-year ROI. So if you're looking at some type of a capital investment in this context, it's generally, if you're longer than 3 years to get your money back for that investment, it's probably not going to happen.
Well, now
And
challenge that. Sorry, Brian. I will challenge that, say, because I'm used to smaller companies too.
yeah.
That's a long ROI. You know, again, a smaller,
Oh yeah.
but again, even if it's a longer ROI, but you're seeing a significant increase, the one thing that I think people fail to think about in terms of velocity is there's 2 types of velocity. There's penetration velocity and repeat velocity.
Yeah.
What I mean by that is penetration of new consumers, right? And then repeat are, you buying the same product. Every time you get a new consumer, that's a potential for a repeat consumer. And every time you get a repeat consumer, that increases the lifetime value.
Yes.
So if you layer those things on, you might find that your ROI is actually a bit better than you expect.
That's a good point. And you brought up a good thing there as well too, that we'll talk about more as well too, is that the size of the company matters. Is if you're the CEO of a company with less than 30 million a year in annual revenue, your decision-making process is going to be different than a company with $1 billion in sales. You have a different window, you have a different lead time, you have different finances, you have, as you'd mentioned, investors and everybody else who's looking for a return on their faith in you to build that company. That's driving decisions, isn't it?
It's really interesting. I think being the smaller you are, the more there's a lot more challenge, right? And here's an example. If you are a $5 million company and you have a recall, let's put it to the ultimate extreme. Not, you have a recall or you have a really bad situation, your company's probably dead. I mean, at that point, chances are you cannot bounce back from that. Boris Head has a recall, right, which happened a year ago or whatever it's been now. It was a blip, right? They dealt with it, they moved on. Tylenol. I mean, there's been a lot of big companies that have had these. It's terrible, but they're able to bounce back. Or another way to say it is, if you have a bad Oreo, you're probably going to come back and give Oreo another shot.
Yeah.
If you eat XYZ company's new product and it's moldy and gross, you're probably never giving that company a shot again.
No.
And so it isn't. So someone comes and says, well, here's how you solve that. Well, that's phenomenal. I can't pay for that because I'm a small company. $50,000 is a huge investment for that small company. So if you're working with smaller companies, I think you really need to think about that balance of how do we protect the ultimate risk to the company, but understanding that the resources are so limited. So it's putting as much cushion around it. But again, you might get T-boned. I always kind of joke that with a smaller company, luck is really, really important. Not good luck, avoiding bad luck.
Yes.
So creating relationships with the QA at your co-man, creating relationships with your suppliers and how they're dealing with QA, because you're not going to have your own QA person. You're going to be reliant on your suppliers, on your co-man. All these conversations, it's almost in reverse. Instead of the QA coming to you, you need to go to the QA and say, help me understand how you think about this. Help me understand how we mitigate these risks. What tests are you doing? It's not that expensive for you to add a test into the mix if you're a smaller company, if you want to protect yourself, right? So I think it's more of a reverse play the smaller you are versus incorporating QA into your organization.
Right. And yeah, so for those type of companies, right? If you're a small company, odds are you're using a co-man. You don't have the capital to build out $100 million plant. No, you're going to be, and so you need to work with that company to make sure they're working on your behalf because guess what? They have their own company to run and they have 20 other customers too. So how are you working with them? How are you making sure that they understand your wants and needs? Because they want to keep you happy.
Yeah.
But this was always the paradox with co-mans because guess what, guys? Even big companies use co-packers because if you're a big company and you're launching a new product and you're not sure it's going to work, guess what? You're going to go to a co-man and use their line capability to launch that product to see if it's going to justify building that into your operations. Co-mans are used all the time. And if you're a small company, you may be limited in the co-mans you can use. And so back to your point, Dustin, there's going to be a risk assessment with that of who you can actually use. If you're a big company, guess what? If you're a large CPG, you are also limited because there's only so many co-mans out there that can actually meet your capacity needs because you're huge and you need to make sure you're working with the right people. So these decisions don't go away; they just change. And I think too, you made a good point here for the small companies, Dustin, is that if you're the CEO and you're bringing on those team members, and you had referenced this earlier, where you had people that you were working with in QA that didn't have the right mindset, so you had to bring in new people. Uh, you need to be very entrepreneurial, and that QA person needs to be able to put on multiple hats and tackle whatever needs to be done.
Yeah. Like I said, it becomes a reverse plan. It's understanding what are the pinch points, what are the bottlenecks, what are really going to cause issues for you as a company, and making decisions there. So, for instance, let's say you're marketing yourself as an allergen-free, top 12 allergen-free company, gluten-free company, and you don't have internal QA, and you feel like the co-packer you're working with is not taking that seriously. Well, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong here, but a simple adding on a swab test at the end of production or during production, minor, not that big an impact, not that costly, has a huge potential way to save your business, right?
Yeah.
So you can put into place in most co-mans, they're going to be happy. They don't care if you're paying for it, they'll do it, right?
Yeah.
And if that's important to you and you don't feel like you're being given the QA standards that are important to you as a company to protect your core assets of the company, then you should put those into place. One thing I also kind of preach, and my preacher hat is if you haven't, I'm going to come back to how this impacts QA, but I say this from a marketing landscape. I work with a lot of companies that have a lot of crazy ingredients, or they've spent,
Superfoods. Yeah.
yeah, they have all these things in their ingredients. But if you pay for something as a manufacturer, as a brand, that you are not getting credit for from the consumer, why are you spending money on that? So let's
Oh,
say, for instance, you spend an extra 30% to have compostable packaging, but you're selling candy to kids. I'm just making this up.
yeah.
Okay, it's great that you have compostable packaging, but now you're charging a dollar more to a consumer that doesn't care. Or maybe you're not charging that dollar more because the consumer doesn't care and you're not getting the benefit of that. Or you market compostable and your 12-year-old kid buying this doesn't care.
Yeah.
The point being, if you have products or ingredients that don't matter to the consumer, don't put them in your product. Now, where I'm flipping
Mhm.
that to QA is to say, if there is something about your product that is critical in nature to the consumer, make sure you protect that aspect. Again, whether it's allergen free or gluten free or probiotics, whatever your messaging is, that's where you need to focus your QA efforts first and foremost, because protect the entity, the asset, the brand that is being created versus, worrying about XYZ issue that ultimately is not that important to the consumer.
Right. And that's back to that element of trust. If you have that consumer base that is buying based on your claim of allergen free, to your
Yeah,
point, and you violate that,
you're done.
done. You're done.
Yeah. Especially as a small company. But even, people now, the reaction is so immediate and swift. And there's good and bad things to the way the marketplace works now, is that things kind of go in and out of cycle quickly, right?
Yeah.
So like using the board set example, back in the day, that would have been probably a news cycle for weeks, right? It came, it went, it was dealt with and moved on. And that's probably due to that and how Borset handled it. But ultimately, I would say it's really important, the smaller you are, to focus on the critical nature of your business and make sure that's protected. Everything else is secondary. As a bigger company, it still holds true. But you and I used to work at White Wave together. And do you remember the Rachel's product?
Oh yeah.
So Rachel's was a cottage cheese that had other stuff in it. Like I can't even remember, but maybe
Oh
herbs
yeah.
or
Yeah. All kinds of crazy flavors and
yeah.
yeah.
There was actual inclusions in it. I loved it
Hmm.
until one day where I opened one and it had some mold in it. And
Hmm.
then a couple times later, I did it, and it happened again. Even as a employee of White Wave, and I'm not knocking our QA friends at White Wave for this, but as a consumer, I was turned off by that. The core
Hmm.
essence of anything in dairy is to not have bad dairy. That's where that focus should be, not on whether or not the packaging was X or this was Y. That's the core essence of that product, and it violated that trust.
Yes.
So I think it's really, really important to focus on the issues that are core to the product, and then everything else comes second after that.
Right. And I love how this is all being framed in terms of brand protection, which is how you should be thinking. So back to the co-man example, right? You have a claim that the consumers trust, and you have a co-man who's doing that. This is where working with your legal team is important. Build that in the contract. Right? So, okay, here's our product specifications. One of our specifications requires finished product testing to verify that that product is allergen free. And guess what? If your product fails that test, you eat it because you made it wrong. We're not paying for that. Get that in writing beforehand. There's a rule I think that we forget in quality a lot of times is if you want something, the best time to get it is before you pay for it. So if you're going out to find a new supplier, they're going to be much more cooperative before the contract is signed and they're being paid. That's the time to strike and to put these things in place.
And and again, agreed. The caveat: smaller companies, the manufacturer's typically going to be like, take it or leave it,
Yeah.
whatever they offer. So fine. So if you have to not to pay for the bad product, but if you have to implement that testing protocol on your end, those few extra bucks, and by the way, that stuff's not that expensive. Again, if you get smart about how and when you test this stuff,
Hmm.
it's well worth that investment and putting that into place because that's going to
Yes.
protect your brand. The co-man, and I'm not knocking co-mans. I ran a co-man. I get the difficulties of
It's hard.
running a co-man.
Yeah.
It's very hard. And again, like everything else, until you wear someone else's shoes, you don't really understand some of the issues. But ultimately, if I ran my co-man a certain way and a client came in demanding X, Y, and Z, I'd be like, go pound sand,
Yeah.
hopefully in a nicer way. But if they came in and said, hey, this is really important to me, how do I partner with you to make this happen? I'm willing to help invest in that. I'd be like, sure, let's figure it out. Right. And
Mhm.
that's a different way to approach that.
Right. And that's a really good point that I want to emphasize here as well, Dustin, is that through this entire conversation here today, partnering is becoming a very important phrase that we're using constantly during this conversation. If I go to that co-man, and again, put on your other hat and say, geez, if I'm working at that co-man and I'm in charge of quality at that co-man, and I have 20 customers that I need to satisfy, oh, how do they do that? Right? That's really, really hard. How can I make that easier for them? How can I partner with them? And to your point, which I think was great, explain to them why this is important to you and how can we partner? And it could be, okay, this allergen testing super important. We understand your perspective and this is a burden on your business as a co-man. Let's partner on this. Tell you what, I'll split the cost with you 50-50.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. I think most co-mans, I mean, not all, unfortunately, but most are, have the desire to do well. I think
Yes.
what they're struggling with, and again, this is regardless of the size of your company, a co-man's the best thing that can happen to a co-man is you turn the machines on and you let them run. One product consistently throughout the day is the best deal ever. The
Yes.
more switches, the more changes, the more challenges, that's what gets very difficult for manufacturers. And so again, if you're asking them to put in these changes and these processes, it becomes challenging. And so again, it becomes the partnership piece. Let's work together to solve this. How do we help you solve this? What can I do to help you solve this versus I need you to do XYZ, otherwise I can't work with you. Okay, go find another co-man. By the way,
Yes.
co-mans are getting harder and harder to find every day.
Yes, they are.
And
Yeah.
so I think that's really, really important. Partnership, it's just, I do want to stress this that a QA individual has not been trained through their career in P&L management, has not been trained in velocity sales management, has not been trained in marketing. nor has a marketing person been trained in QA, nor has a salesperson been trained in ops, right? We all kind of have these false senses of understanding what the other does. And so I'm going to kind of give this, I grew up in the big CPG world. I worked at General Mills, and then I went to White Wave. And when I started my own company, one of my favorite stories is I started this food company. I had 15 years of CPG experience. So my investors, some of them, just assumed I knew what I was doing, and I thought I knew what I was doing. And so, what's one of the first things you have to do as a brand is get a UPC. And I was like, oh, I have literally no idea how to get UPC. And I'm 15 years into this, and I didn't want to ask anyone because I was scared of the implications of like, oh, how does Dustin not know how to get UPC? The point I'm trying to raise is like through this journey, I ended up learning how to book shipments and how to get freight and how to order, things that I never dealt with. And so I tell people one of the best things you can do in your organization, especially if you do have cross-functional resources, is do this like once a week, once a month. Pick a employee or a staff member of another department, go to lunch and just be like, tell me what you do. Help me understand. So if a QA sits down with logistics, help me understand how you book shipments, how you get product from A to B, goes to sales. How do you sell into a retailer? How do you get velocity? How does the retailer think about this? You go to marketing. Why are you doing that TikTok ad? The more you can understand the other parts of business, not only makes you incredibly more valuable in your career, but when these issues pop up, you know how to start thinking about the solutions and going to the right people to solve them. That's when I mentor junior people kind of entering their career, that's the first piece of advice. Understand your cross-functional worlds, and it'll make you so much stronger.
100%. And yeah, a CEO becomes a CEO because they're good at running a company and they're hired by the board of directors to do that. That doesn't imply that they understand food, and they may need to learn, and you need to help them learn. There's a question here that we have from Janie. Let's pull this up here. Is what strategies can we use to justify and communicate a food safety driven packaging change in a way that builds rather than erodes trust? And how do you weigh those benefits? Yeah, that's a hard question.
I know Janine, and I know exactly what she's asking. I think based on the conversations I've had with her, what she's asking. So I'll hopefully Janine's okay with this, but she has an amazing hummus company, actually Zaka Hummus, which for those of you out there, it's a fantastic product. And she had to add kind of a ridge underneath the product, and to help with I think it was to help with HPP processing and other things. And so consumers thought she was doing shrinkflation. And it was actually to improve the quality, right? And so she gets all these consumer complaints like, you're screwing us, you're trying to shrink the product, blah, blah, blah. And I do think, and honestly, I'm not sure I have a great answer to this yet because I've already had the chance to think about this type of question. So Brian, I'm going to throw it back on you maybe to help answer this. But I do think if you make changes that impact consumer perception, this goes back to what I said before, communicate it to the consumer. I don't know the exact way right now to do that in this particular case, but I do think it's really, really important. Again, just like any ingredient you have that's a benefit to the consumer, any package change that isn't necessarily going to be seen as a benefit to the consumer, communicating that through social, through QR codes, through digital displays. In Janine's case, on shelf, it's got to be clear on the package, maybe during the initial package change. New package, here's why, or whatever. But I'll let you kind of give your thoughts on that one too.
Yeah, here's my take on this is, so there's a couple ways this could happen. Let's say proactively or reactively. So let's say it's a reactive situation. All of a sudden you didn't think about this scenario and complaints just go, quah, right? Okay, crap, right? We missed that. I'm going to work with, and this is again, working interdepartmentally. I'm going to work with our consumer affairs team, whoever's actually picking up that phone or answering the emails, and working with them to put together some language that they can communicate to those consumers to explain to them the why of why that happened. If you're able to do that proactively, guess what? Having less packaging is more eco-friendly. Maybe we should, hey, marketing people, maybe we should put that on the packaging. I see that now with Amazon. When I get Amazon deliveries, they'll have on there, this box saves more material than the bags we used to use, right? They're being proactive in stopping those complaints from happening because they're educating the consumer. So you can work those into your systems. It could be also, and this gets back to your points, Dustin, of running the business. Let's say that I have a level of complaints for a product, for a package that doesn't open very well. And consumers are like, yeah. And every month I'm getting a complaint rate that's very steady associated with that. I need to bring that information to senior management. And again, this gets back to our comments on company size and actually how much capital do you have and ROI and everything else. And say, okay, well, we can fix this packaging problem and I can reduce our complaints probably by 75%, but it's going to cost the company $5 million. Do we want to tolerate that level of complaints? Because they're steady, they're not increasing. Or do we want to reduce it? What's the benefit to the company? And talking in those terms.
I'm going to put it in reverse on this one. So, there's a ton of times where I open a package and, you have to peel off the protective layer and it's impossible to get a grip and it's so frustrating and then it half rips. And I think about that. And if you came to the CEO or executive team or whatever and you said, look, here's what's happening. The complaints are holding steady. It's going to cost this much. This is the part though, I said 80-20, right? 80% analytical. So let's say the analytics show apples to apples one way or the other. Not really a big deal. If we do it, there is an ROI. If we do it, who cares? This is where the 20% does come in. Eventually, that's going to become a problem to me where I'm going to go try and solve it.
Yeah.
As a consumer with a different brand, right? But here's the flip side to that. You need to really understand the whole product value. There's a value equation in a product. Why does a consumer buy a product? So when I was working at Abbott Laboratories, EAS, for those of you who remember the EAS brand, the protein actually started in Golden, Colorado. When I was joining the company, their big game plan, for those of you who ever opened any type of powdered supplement product, what happens? You have to dig your hand in to find the scoop because it's been shaken all around. So EAS had this brilliant idea of putting the scoop in the lid, which is actually very smart. It's that way, it's always in the lid. Yeah. Here's the thing. On the value equation of choosing a product that was so low. So while it was great for those of people who bought EAS already, it wasn't going to create a switching phenomenon because they chose on protein level, on ingredients, on brand, blah, blah, blah. The scoop fell 10th on that list. So again, it's always thinking, this is why QA partnering with sales and marketing to understand the scoop. We're getting complaints about the scoop in the thing. Marketing can come back and say, well, realistically, we've done the analysis. It's 10th on the value equation. It's a nice to have. If we can fix it, awesome, but it's not worth $5 million of equipment to do that.
Right. Exactly. Well, this conversation has absolutely flown by, Dustin. And so with that, we'll bring this back up to the 30,000 foot level. And what are some of the kind of the key points here today that you'd like to leave with our audience?
Well, I'll just rehash the buzzwords that we've said quite a bit: partnership, collaboration, analytics, ROI, and positivity. And if you kind of hit those buzzwords and you focus on those things, I think you'll see a dramatic difference if you're having difficulty getting your message or program across the finish line. I think those things will help tremendously.
Yep, absolutely. And if you're able to change, if you're working in quality assurance and food safety, and if you can change your mindset to, as you were talking about, brand protection, customer retention, and scalable growth, and talk in those terms, you're going to see the way that people interact with you change dramatically.
Yeah, just really quick to hit on that. Again, think about your conversations with lawyers. Roger, going back to Roger, I loved going to Roger for his input because I wasn't scared that he's going to be, oh, this is bad, you're going to get sued. If you can frame yourself to the QA person that people are going to go to and get advice and guidance and proactive growth from, you'll get a lot of great allies in the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would come to him sometimes and I would come to him for advice because he was so good at it. Yeah. And you would go and talk with him, and his first reaction 9 times out of 10 would be to sit back and go,
Yeah.
He would think about it for a while, and then he would ask you a question back.
Yeah, and that's great. I love it. Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Oh yeah, you bet. Let me put in the link here to the Marler Clark article that I referenced earlier. So definitely read through that. Wow, great chat. Dustin, you always just overperform. Thank you for coming on. This has been fantastic. Thank you.
Anytime.
And everybody, that'll bring our chat to a close here for this week. Of course, we're going to be back here next week at the same time with another amazing guest like Dustin at the same time, 8 a.m. Mountain Time, 10 a.m. Eastern, and we'll talk all things food safety. So in the meantime, enjoy the weekend. Get out there, have a little bit of fun. I'm going to see a comedian tonight. I'm going to go see Louis C.K.
Oh,
which is going to
it's
be,
awesome.
yeah, I'm excited, super excited to see that. Go have some fun, and we'll see you back here next week. Thanks, everybody. See you then.
Bye.